Um, Good morning, everybody. It's a early Tuesday, and we will look into the subsequent topics of this course, corporate law and regulation. Today, a lecture, then subsequently a workshop lecture-like session with the whole group. We will do the attendance thingy in the break, allowing everybody to settle in. And well, that's the menu. Thursday coming, you will do the what is it? The career fair activity, isn't it? So I hope you will enjoy that. In the third year, that's quite a sensible thing to do. To look into the question, what career would be a logical fit for you personally. Welcome everybody. We are about to start today a ambitious program. I try to go through all these concepts in a high pace, so that it is not becoming boring, but I do realize that they will settle in, those concepts, only after a while. And in that while you will have to do the reading. And today we will look at a very important topic, the mergers and acquisitions. And my experience / hope is that by discussing the idea that one company purchases the other company, that those core characteristics are more easy to understand. So I hope that with that topic, which was in the past only in week 6, but I move it now to week 2, that we have a better grip on the core characteristics. I saw that many of you did the enrollment in terms of the paper topic and presentation date. So let's look into that during the workshop. Are there any other preliminary observations, questions prior to starting off the third core characteristic? No. And today we will do the core characteristics number 3, 4, and 5. And the 3, the 4, and the 5 are red. I must say that on this screen that's less visible, but I believe in the back that you see the difference between the black and the red, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so for the audience here in the front row, that's sort of red. Let's work on that. Okay, the first one is the delegated management, and that's a crucial one in your paper and presentation. The delegated management, also known as the board, will play a major role in your analysis. So let's look at that. It's a question of the position in the corporate structure. So the first question is, where in the map of the whole corporation does the management fit in? And we have the shareholders, and when the shareholders meet, we call that the annual meeting. We have the legal person, we discussed that last week. We have the board, so that's where they fit in. Then we have workers, so other employees. And then, quite importantly, a sort of rectangle, a red rectangle, which is a sort of border of what we count to the firm. So when you look at the red box, the borders, then shareholders are perceived and conceptualized as not being part of the firm. They are the owner of the firm. And then the combination of unequal things like the legal person, the board, the employees, other resources, assets, that together is then the firm. So when the board would be robots, shareholders own the legal person, and in that legal person they own the board. That's sort of, from a property law perspective, a theoretical perspective. Obviously, board members are not robots, so they are human beings, and consequently, given all the ambitions of societies, they are seen as the most responsible human beings in the firm. And they are endowed with a long list of expectations, up to and including corporate social responsibility, etc. So that is what we will discuss in this topic. They have relationships in the sense that they are appointed by the shareholders. They are employees of the legal person. They are the boss of the workers. They are the signing party, so the humans that sign contracts on behalf of the legal person in respect to third parties, outsiders. They are the representatives when state organs, tax authorities are knocking on the door of the firm, and then the board needs to speak it. And they are potentially personal liable when they are not acting in accordance to rules and regulations. The easiest example is when the firm does not pay taxes, then the board members are personal liable. There's a sort of trick of societies, of states, to make board members personal liable. We will discuss that in the next core characteristic, but let's mention it already. As an incentive that the humans, being the board, are first paying the taxes and then taking care of other things of the firm. So a cluster of relationships. And legal thinking is that in a situation, for instance in the company you are reviewing in the paper, you address each individual relationship step by step. Because they have all kinds of different flavors, colors, consequences. So take that each time step by step. So when it is about the relationships, there's no such thing as the relationship of board members, but there are multiple relationships. Very important. Then a confusing thing, that what in this book is called delegated management has many different names. And those names are today seen as synonyms, as board, as management, as directors, as chief executive officers, chief financial officers, chief operational officers, chief compliance officers. So on the slide it says ABC. So in the meantime we have a lot of versions of the ABC. I mentioned the executive, finance, operational. What do we have? Compliance. What else do we have? Any ideas? Financial, yeah, chief financial officer, etc. Then in the view of the workers, the management is the boss. So the pinnacle layer to which you have to adhere to. And last but not least, when you view a firm as a corporate thing, so all the items within the red rectangle, then the board is one of the organs. And here you can bigger whether it is the heart or the kidney or the brain, maybe all of that. So the vocabulary of corporate law, by using the word corporate, which is derived from the Latin corpus, which means body, in that type of vocabulary, the term organ fits in, because a body has organs. When you take that step, that there is a body and organs, then next to the board there are other organs. Most importantly, the annual meeting of shareholders. And then it starts to become a little bit complicated, because 5 minutes ago I said shareholders are sort of external. But the moment that shareholders convene and establish sort of collective once a year to determine annual statements, to appoint or dismiss board members, those rights we will repeat each time, then it is also regarded as an organ. And the reason to portray it as an organ is that legislators then can define sort of responsibilities of that organ to not make unwanted decisions as an organ. So the vocabulary of bodily parts, including the word organ, facilitates legislators to zoom in on such an organ and develop all kinds of rules and regulations. Where individual shareholders, you know, they are spread all over the world, you and me. So they live somewhere, and it's difficult to identify them. I mean, there is a register with their names, electronically, but as a legislator, you cannot easily talk with them. Not the least because that ownership changes in a split second, depending on the trade on stock market. But then when they meet, then all of a sudden they have a sort of identity, and we also call them organ. And when you have multiple organs, then obviously the question is, which one is the most important? Then you get a sort of thinking in terms of competition. And I must admit that discussing these core characteristics and then combine that with sort of the actual complexity of firms makes it not so easy. So I recommend to reread chapter 1 once in a while, because there you can see the sort of ingredients in a sort of prose explained on those core characteristics. So then we have the agency issue in the strict sense of the word. So if that organ of the board, also called the management, is the agent, what are then those tasks? And then the most striking feature of this organ is that they have an exclusive right and obligation to represent the firm, the legal person. And this you can best remember in terms of signatures. Whatever contract there is pertaining to the firm, to the corporation. The only signature that counts is that of the board. And never of the shareholder. So the fascinating thing is that we feel shareholders as being the owner, and owner sounds like determines what happens. But the fascinating thing and very strict thing, so jurists are very particular about that, is that only the board, the management, is allowed exclusively to represent the legal person. In a way, just to remember it, if the owner, the 100% owner of the firm, is signing a employment contract with someone, that contract is invalid. So that is how legal professionals connect consequences to concepts like exclusiveness, and then to declare that contract invalid. And obviously, ladies and gentlemen, for non-multinational enterprises, let's say the butcher at the corner of the street, you can combine heads. You can be 100% owner of the legal person and appoint yourself as management. So then you have two roles. And then the same human being, same signature, can be on that employment contract, but then the correct way to present that in the paper, in the presentation, in exam, is then to say in his or her capacity as board member. So that's sort of the funny, sort of nitty-gritty legal professionals connect to the concept of exclusiveness. Then the next thing is also fascinating, that this authority to represent the legal person is without boundaries. So whatever talk you had with the owner, when you are on your own representing the firm, you can do whatever you want. In the sense that the legal system, so the jurisdictions, do not want to have paralyzed board members running around in the economy who are authorized to sign contracts and then could say to the economy, oh, I'm so sorry, but my shareholder did not agree. That would be extremely inconvenient for the flow in the economy. And that is why all the major jurisdictions state that whatever deal is made by the board, that is a binding deal. And if the shareholders disagree, well, then they have to discuss that among themselves, maybe dismiss the board member, but in terms of the outside economy, that's a valid deal. So, strictly speaking, in terms of legal transactions, if the board of Shell decides tomorrow morning to sell all the oil platforms, then that is a valid deal. Obviously, buyers of all those oil platforms, they don't want to run risks. So by those major transactions, there's a sort of distrust on the side of the buyer whether that rule invented by legal professionals will ultimately stand, and that not the owners will after all say whatever the jurisdiction says, I still dislike the transaction because we are all oil company and without oil platforms we cannot produce oil. So what should we do with all the cash as the result of the sale? So you could run into all kinds of litigation, but legal professionals regard that as then a valid transaction. So that's an important item. And obviously the third item is this internal accountability. So if you do transactions that are to the disliking of the owners, the shareholders, then they have this authority 24/7 to dismiss you. That is called internal accountability. So you need to look at that in a sort of very mechanistic way. Representation is acting in the name of the legal person. And that's also a sort of technicality invented by legal professionals. Because obviously, if the CEO of Shell purchases oil platforms, he's not doing that as a private person. Because who is purchasing oil platforms for billions? But technically speaking, in representing the legal person, you have to add the words as a sort of mantra. On behalf of Shell, I hereby purchase oil platform. So that's sort of typical legal professional thinking, and that is why the legal department, your future colleagues, will add once in a while on your contracts, assuming that part of you will realize deals, and they will then check the last page whether it says on behalf of the company, around where the name of the board member is printed. And so that's the sort of thinking that is, when you look at it from a private law angle, a sort of characteristic of the legal concept of agency. So you have the economic, so the agency, principal agency problem approach to the word agency. But when you act on behalf of someone else, that is also a private law concept, also called agency. And if on an exam you're asked, well, define what such concept is in legal terms, then you mention that it is representation on behalf of the other, in this case, the legal person. So it's just a sort of list you could add in terms of defining what is going on around the board. And then last but not least, if such a representation, technical agency is taking place, the legal consequences are burdering the legal person. So the whole idea developed by jurists on agency is that the legal person is bound by the consequences of the transaction. And that is why the organ of the management is called the brain and mouth of the legal person. So they think and they act and they speak and they sign contract on behalf of the legal person. Then we move to an important distinction you will meet in the paper and the presentation. And that is that the organ of the management has different shapes in the jurisdictions we discussed. And the keywords are one tier and two tier. And the whole distinction has to do with an idea that if you have a board of 12 human beings, ideally 6 women, 6 male human beings, that not all 12 have the same tasks. And since shareholders are at arm's length, so far away, we talk about the core characteristic of delegated management, there's this desire, last half century, to assign supervisory tasks to a few persons of that 12 body management. So that there's a role division. So one is the CEO, could sign, the leader, and a few board members are the having a supervisory role. And there's a lot of confusion around that supervisory role. And that confusion comes because, especially in the continental jurisdictions, so the Netherlands, Germany, France, this supervisory role is sort of upgraded to a separate name, so-called supervisory board. In Dutch, Raad van Commissarissen. And that feels as if there is another organ. That you have the supervisory board and the executive board. But when you look at that theme from the core characteristic perspective, the scholarly perspective, all the board members, whatever name, are delegated management. So, towards the outside world, so the marketing aspect, companies like Shell and General Electric and Boeing, they like to portray their supervisory board members as independent. Dear society, don't worry, we have executive people, but we also have independent supervisory board members. So don't worry, we will take care of interests of all stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, from a legal perspective, from a scholarly perspective, these supervisory board members are not independent. Despite phrases in the legislation that encourages enterprises to, well, work on the independence of those supervisory board members, they are part of delegated management. They are employees of the legal person. They get paid. And they act ultimately, despite all the beautiful marketing language, on behalf of the legal person. Unless, in the extreme versions of electricity companies, where the state is shareholder and then having the right to appoint supervisory board members, then you might say that that person is independent. But let's think on the board delegated management in a hardcore legal professional way and skip all the marketing language like, oh, they're independent and they will take care of you, dear society. That is not how a jurist would portray it. And that is then a very short step towards a relaxed attitude towards one tier or two tier. If it is all delegated management, then we don't care whether the supervisory members and the executive members are in one room called one tier and each has a different role, or that we do it in two rooms, two tier, with two names, supervisory board, in Dutch Raad van Commissarissen, and executive board. One step in your paper and presentation is that you identify in your company whether they created a one tier or a two tier board, and that's a easy connection point to explain in a scholarly manner what that means. So the assessment is also an invitation to show off that you understand intellectual concepts. And one tier, two tier is an ideal example with which you can easily say, look, they have this board, it's either two tier or one tier, which means, and then you say intelligent things about what such a board means. And that is one of the added values of sort of critical legal thinking, that you could see through the mechanisms that corporate world creates to well, mesmerize societies in terms of responsibilities beyond creating profit, etc. Well, the appointment and the dismissal is a critical next theme, and the mechanism is very simple. They are appointed by the shareholders and dismissed by the shareholders. That's the basic rule. And then, in jurisdictions in Europe, when they put that in their articles of incorporation, that's sort of the basic law constitution of the legal person, they could say in the design that the shareholders appoint the supervisory board and that they delegate the authority to appoint executive board members to that supervisory board. So the basic main rule is shareholders appoint board members, but if you have such an authority, you could delegate that to that sub-organ called supervisory board. And that is part of this sort of scheme in which large companies try to arrange it in such a way that it does not look and feel too much as a sort of toy of the shareholders, but that is a sort of responsible, integrative approach where quasi-independent supervisory board members are having the delegated task to appoint board members. And then those supervisory board members are not necessarily shareholders, or ideally they are not shareholders. So they are regarded to act less on the basis of emotion. Emotion in terms of the stock value is dropping, let's dismiss the board. Because if there's anybody responsible, that's the management when stocks drop. Why do they drop? Because they make the wrong decision. That's the thinking behind the economic activity. Well, and the dismissal right is the most important incentive for board members to listen to shareholders. So when we say board members are independent in the sense that they decide what they do, that is obviously in the light that if they displease shareholders, they will be dismissed. And that can be done 24/7 during your whole career. And that is one of the reasons why they earn that lot of money with the multinational enterprises we discuss in this CORP. Because they have a commitment which might end tomorrow morning, which is sort of scary if you have a family, you know. And if there's a high risk, that is part of your degree, then prices go up. If there's low risk, prices go down. And the same applies to salaries of chief executive officers or the board members in general. And then, talking about remuneration, depending on the design of the Articles of Incorporation, also the decision how they are paid could be delegated to, for instance, the supervisory board. And when you look at all those M&As we discussed in this class, they created a remuneration committee next to the board. Because salary is a sort of social issue at the moment, you know, with the gap between rich and poor, and that CEOs earn 600 times more than the lowest paid employee. That's sort of socially sensitive topic. So they almost all created a independent remuneration committee who advises the shareholders on that decision how to pay them. Again, with this idea that society will be quiet if it is done in such a independent way. But from a legal perspective, those members of the remuneration committee are just board members, are just employees of the firm and are acting in the interest of the firm. And so don't repeat in the paper and the presentation the marketing language of your M&E that says independently established. So be critical. Don't eat the marketing language on the tab investor relationships. That's sort of source of your paper and presentation. Well, and then the tasks are all encompassing. So the tasks of the management, the board, the directors, the CEOs, all synonyms for those in charge, those appointed by the shareholders, is make it happen. And that is a very vast task. Because making happen means avoiding that you go bankrupt the next day. Involve heavily in people, planet, profit in various orders of importance. Develop markets. Be nice to your employees, your workforce. Be nice to the state you work in. Pay your taxes. Develop good products and make profit. And well, the PPP, people, planet, profit. So I invite you, I urge to be very straightforward the moment you discuss the board. Yes?
I don't really understand what the responsibility is of the supervisory board, because they're supposed to supervise, but what are they supposed to supervise?
The question is, what is the task of the supervisory board? Good question. So if the general task of the delegated management as a concept is make it happen, and then the moment there is such a thing as a earmarked task of supervision, then the supervisory board members are not supposed to be active on the floor and make it happen. Their task is to supervise the colleague board members who are then the executive, so the signing contracts type of management. And especially in a two-tier board, you can visualize that when the supervisory board in Dutch Raad van Commissarissen meet, that they will restrict themselves to the supervisory role. That means that then the executive board sends a report to the supervisory board with their diary, as in, we did this and this and this and this. Please confirm that you think that we did a good thing. And that's sort of the role play. In the one-tier board, ladies and gentlemen, those individuals sit in one room. And then the executive board members are sort of like this, and the supervisory board members are like this. But they are all human beings in the same board, or in the same room. So when you would record that conversation, then I'm sure that once in a while, a supervisory board member would say, would it be not nice to develop a second edition of the iPad? Because I heard that Samsung is doing things like that. And so human beings with ideas and experience, they get involved. So on paper, their task is just to supervise. But in practice, that's a sort of fluid thing. But towards the outside world, they say, no, we just supervise. As long as their signature is not on the contract, because that is an executive type of task. Having said that, in all those jurisdictions, they are just board members. So when there are no executive board members, then a member of the supervisory board can sign. So assume that you dismiss all the executive board members. What happens once in a while? Then you still if you have a 1 or 2 tier board, you have some supervisory board members left. By law, they are board members, so when a annual meeting needs to be presided or a employee needs to be contracted, then their signature also counts. So, as an answer to your question, the idea is to divide roles, but the law has not such sophisticated tools, as in that you can be half pregnant. So either you're bored or you're not bored. Funny, isn't it? Where the society wants a sort of this hybrid supervisory role only type of position, and the jurisdictions try to put that in the legislation, but they did not make them not bored. So then they're still bored. And from a conceptual perspective, delegated management is delegated management, whatever title you have. Last but not least, all the board members have a collective responsibility for the outcome. So, in the jurisdictions we discuss, if you run into financial problems as a company, and we move to the next topic in terms of liability, then a board member cannot say, well, I was not chief financial officer, so I don't know anything about numbers. That excuse is not available. Why? Because the law does not distinguish between these types of roles in such a literal way. So they see it as one collective. Either with one human being, 2 human beings, 3, 10, 12, 24. So up to 30-ish. That's sort of the maximum on the globe. I mean, imagine that all of you run Toyota. That's sort of complicated at a certain set. Here are some legal rules. We will discuss that in the workshop a little bit more. And then this legal regulation is repeated in individual articles of incorporation. So one of the documents you pull up as part of your paper presentation is that you have the articles of incorporation of your M&E on your hard disk. And then those articles of incorporation, the constitution of that legal person, repeats sort of what the law says of the jurisdiction where it is established. So you quite often see phrases like this. This is the Unilever Articles of Incorporation, and it says, the management of the company shall be conducted by the board of directors. A sort of repetition what the law says. So that shareholders on the Fuji Islands, interested in investing in Unilever, when their question would be, their legal department, small legal department, small island, when they want to know who represents the company, then they look at Article 9.1 of the Articles of Incorporation and say, oh, it's a normal company. It follows the general ID of the core characteristics identified in all those major jurisdictions. And then 19.2, it says, the board of directors shall consist of 1 or more executive directors and non-executive directors. And then on an exam, my question could be, is this a 1-tier or a 2-tier board? What's your gut feeling? 50% chance. 2-tier? I would say, yes?
1 tier?
1 tier?
Because it's one board.
Exactly. So it is 1 tier because it says the board. So 1 board. We will meet in the workshop a 2-tier one, and then the language is next to the board herewith a supervisory board is established. But here you see how tricky articles of incorporation and the law can be. Because the words 1 tier, 2 tier are not put in the law and in the articles of incorporation. That is sort of conceptual scholarly thinking. So, just as an example. Let's move to the limited liability. That's number 4. Let's be quick on that. Liability is about that unwanted things happen, and the question is, who should pay? And I use a sort of simplistic example of broken ships, because that's sort of close to tort law that you discussed in the previous courses in the minor. Tort law as in the non-contractual liability established by law. And so the jurisdiction says we want persons to be liable if an act happens which could be contributed to the actor, which results in damage to third parties. If and when there is a causal link between the act and the damage. And then the law says, in all the jurisdictions, then the actor should pay the damage. That's the core idea, which in the core characteristics is called liability and limited liability. And the limited part means that you're not liable. And the question is, how do you establish that? Let's move from a broken ship to actions of human beings called board members or the legal person. 1. A corporation could produce damage because of the decision of a board member. For instance, the board decides to temper the software of diesel engines so that they are favorably tested in state test facilities. And then the emission of those diesel engines is larger than promised and damaging the environment. So the damage is in the environment. And then since the actions of the board and employees are attributed to the legal person, because when you purchase an oil platform, you're not doing that as a private person, and when you ruin the environment, you're not doing that as a private person. So in this example, Volkswagen is ruining the environment. So that is why legal professionals say then that the corporation is liable. So the good transactions of a board are attributed to the corporation, the legal person, and the bad actions of the board members are attributed to the corporation. The same applies to all the employees. Is an employee of Albert Heijn ruins some milk cans in filling in the shop, then that employee is not personal liable. It's the enterprise that employs the employee. And there's a sophisticated mechanism also to include a few others, subcontractors, who could create damage on behalf of the corporation. And then, how do we get to the limited part? And the limited part, so that the person itself is not individually liable, that is an invention of the law. So the law says explicitly, repeated in Articles of Incorporation, the law says you are not personal liable. And the reason why the law says that in the various jurisdictions is to attract human beings to be willing to be board member, employee, etc. first human being is the shareholder. If you're a shareholder on Fuji with 0.1% of the shares of Shell, and Shell ruins Nigeria in the delta with oil, and then the law says, dear Fuji shareholder, you're not personal liable. Step 1. 2. Same with board members. If, as a board member, you did your best not to cause the damage, then you're not liable. And that is why in those modern day examples, when you can doubt whether the board member is of good faith, for instance with the diesel engine tampering of the software, then all of a sudden the limited liability is striking through and you are personal liable. Even to the extent that not only private law, so claims, damage claims, as are now pending in the United States, but also criminal liability is triggered. And that the public prosecutor is knocking on your door as board member of Volkswagen and asking you, what about tampering software on the basis of your instruction? And then obviously board members first say, well, that was not my instruction. I have very bad employees and they invent very bad things. So don't shoot at me. But the beauty of legal thinking is that ultimately the board member is having a all-encompassing task package up to and including whatever employees are doing. And then in second stage, they always find memos in your email inbox. So if you feel you're destined to trick the law, stop emailing. But I hope that you feel destined to the other part. But all the CEOs in jail are there because they could not resist to confirm the instruction by email. And the public prosecutor has access to your inbox. All right. If, last point before the break. Now let's move to the example. So this is the articles of incorporation of ExxonMobil, one of those huge M&As, and they repeated what is in the law in their jurisdiction in the articles of incorporation. So that no director shall be personally liable to the corporation or its shareholders for damages for breach of any duty owed to the corporation or its shareholder. And that is always breaches in the regular course of action. So the normal execution of your tasks. But if you are stepping outside the normal execution of your task, then obviously in that relationship between the firm and the manager you can be held liable because you stepped outside the normal course of action. Just as an example. So in the workshop we will read and review those actual legal rules that try to articulate this sort of complicated thing that you're not liable, but sometimes you are liable. And that's sort of fine-tuning language choice, where one jurisdiction is more successful than the other. But the idea is the same in all the major jurisdictions. Let's have a break of 11 minutes and then continue with transferability of shares, the last 5 or the 5th topic of the core characteristics. See you in a bit.